Long ago, before the great kingdoms of men were etched into marble or carved into the face of cliffs, there were people who came from the sea. No one knew where they began. No maps mark their homeland. No single scroll tells their full story. But across the shores of the eastern Mediterranean, their arrival left echo shadows in burned cities, stories passed down in frightened whispers, and questions that still drift like sea foam at dawn. They were called the Sea Peoples. We do not know what they called themselves. The name we use today comes from the ancient scribes of Egypt and the Levant, who described terrifying waves of warriors arriving by ships bringing ruin and flame. These were not just raiders. They were different, organized, relentless. Entire cities were emptied. Cultures collapsed, yet just as suddenly as they appeared, they were gone. To understand them, we must first return to the world before their arrival. A world made of kingdoms like Mycenae, Ugarit, Hatti, and Egypt. These were powerful civilizations, with temples, scribes, bronze weapons, and bustling ports. They traded with one another. They fought wars. They worshipped gods whose names still echo faintly in stone. And across their lands, things had been steady for centuries. But then something changed. Slowly, and then all at once, the old order began to falter. Cities that had stood for generations fell into silence. Palaces burned. Scripts that had been used for official records vanished, never to return. It was as though the lights of the Bronze Age dimmed, flickering one by one. And rising in that darkness came the Sea Peoples, arriving without warning and disappearing just as quickly. Their story is not told in one place. It is scattered, etched in broken walls, painted on faded tombs, and buried in lost languages. We find them mentioned in Egypt, where pharaohs recorded great battles against strange enemies. We find signs of their attacks in the ruins of Ugarit, where tablets speak of urgent calls for help that never arrived in time. Their ships were said to be swift, their warriors armored in bronze, their faces unfamiliar. Who were they? Some believe they were refugees, people fleeing famine, drought, or earthquake. Others say they were warriors seeking conquest, driven by hunger or desperation. Perhaps they were both. Perhaps their journey began as survival and became something more, a tide that could not be turned back. A force that neither understood nor cared for borders and crowns. Their movements shook the world. The Hittite Empire, which had stood strong in Anatolia for centuries, collapsed. The great cities of the Levant were ravaged. Even mighty Egypt, though it held them back in battle, never fully recovered. And after the Sea Peoples passed, the world was different. Simpler, quieter. A kind of stillness settled over the lands, as if the earth itself had exhaled. But still, they remain a mystery. Their name, their origin, their faith, tall lost to time. We search for them in pottery shards and coastal graves. We wonder if they were one people or many. Were they driven by ambition or by need? Were they conquerors or wanderers? Or were they something in between? Caught in the chaos of a changing world, swept into legend by the tide? As you rest now, picture the ancient sea calm and wide under a fading sun. Picture ships drifting slowly toward shore, sails fluttering, silent oars dipping into the water. Picture distant voices, strange but human, calling across the surf. The Sea Peoples came without warning. And though the waves have long since erased their footprints, their story waits just beneath the surface. Before the Sea Peoples appeared, the world around the Mediterranean was thriving. This was the late Bronze Age, a time of complex cities, rich trade networks, powerful kingdoms that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the banks of the Nile. Every shoreline held a story. Every port echoed with the sounds of languages both familiar and strange. And in this world, people believed they had built something that would last forever. The Mycenaeans ruled the lands of Greece, crafting citadels with thick stone walls and writing in a script we now call Linear B to the east. The Hittite Empire dominated Anatolia with its iron-rich lands and ambitious kings. Farther south, the city of Ugarit thrived as a key trade hub, its merchants connecting cultures from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean. And at the heart of it all stood Egypt, ancient and unshaken, ruled by pharaohs who saw themselves as gods. These kingdoms did not live in isolation. They were connected by a web of trade and diplomacy. Ships crossed the sea loaded with copper, tin, spices, glass, and grain. Letters between kings written on clay tablets showed respect, made demands, and arranged marriages. Treaties were signed. Wars were fought, but they were often controlled and political. It was, for a time, a balanced world. But even the strongest balance is fragile. Beneath the surface, tensions brewed. Crops failed in some regions. Earthquakes shook the earth in others. Droughts crept through the land, unseen at first but devastating over time. When a harvest fails in one year, it is difficult. But when it fails in many places at once, over many years, it becomes something else. It becomes desperation. The people closest to the sea likely felt the changes first. Fish grew scarce. Fields along the coast became too dry. Storms grew stronger. And from these pressures, the first movements may have begun. Small groups, then larger ones, leaving their homelands in search of better lands, easier survival. Some may have asked for shelter, others may have taken it by force. What began as migration slowly became invasion, and the cities of the Bronze Age, so used to order, were unprepared. Their walls were built to stop armies, not whole populations. Their officials knew how to negotiate with kings, not with wandering tribes whose names they didn't know. And so when the first sea peoples arrived, perhaps in canoes, perhaps in ships, they were not seen as a threat. Not at first. They were different, yes, but the world was used to difference. Still, something had changed. These new arrivals did not come to trade. They came in waves, unpredictable and fierce. They burned cities, toppled kings, and vanished before a defense could be formed. They did not take territory to rule it. They simply moved forward, wave after wave, as if driven by something larger than ambitions, something like survival or fear. And yet there is beauty in the mystery, because as we look back on this world, on these cities and scripts and vanished people, we're reminded that even the greatest civilizations are not immune to change. The sea peoples were not just destroyers. They were signs, warnings, symbols of a world reshaping itself, not suddenly, but in slow, unseen currents beneath the surface of history. So now, imagine that old Mediterranean world again. Its golden sunlight, its painted ships, its steady trade winds. Imagine that far on the horizon, where the sea meets the sky, a sail rises, not one you recognize, not a friendly merchant, but something new, something strange, something that will change the world not with speeches, but with silence. As the sun rose on a new century, the eastern Mediterranean slowly shifted from certainty to fear. At first, the signs were distant. A port went silent. A trade route became dangerous. Letters stopped arriving. But then the silence turned to smoke. City after city was attacked. Some never stood a chance. Others fought bravely but fell all the same. Across coastlines once known for beauty and commerce, ash drifted in the breeze. The sea peoples had come. We still do not know how many groups made up this great movement. The Egyptians listed several names: Sherdon, Shekelesh, Luka, Peliset, and more. Were these separate tribes? Were they allies or enemies forced together by desperation? Or were they names misunderstood, passed down through confused scribes and frantic reports? What we do know is that they did not strike as one army. They moved in waves, sometimes coordinated, sometimes not, sometimes settling, sometimes vanishing. One of the most tragic examples comes from Ugarit. This ancient city, near the modern coast of Syria, had stood for centuries as a center of art, trade, and diplomacy. Its people were literate, writing in clay tablets in a language that bridged cultures. But one day letters arrived from allies begging for help. Others warned of incoming ships, and then silence. When archaeologists later uncovered the ruins, they found the city had burned. The tablets were buried mid-sentence. The fall of Ugarit was not unique. Other cities, Byblos, Ashkelon, Alalakhr, also attacked or abandoned. The Hittite capital, Hattusa, was reduced to stone and silence. In Greece, the Mycenaean palaces crumbled. Their linear B-script, so carefully used for taxes and records, disappeared from history for centuries. Across the map, cultures that had once seemed unshakable simply stopped. But why did it all happen at once? The sea peoples played a role, yes, But the collapse was not theirs alone. They were not the only force. There were earthquakes, perhaps linked to shifting tectonic plates. There was drought, confirmed by soil records and pollen analysis. Famine followed. Trade routes broke down. Cities relied on trade to survive, and when ships stopped arriving, people suffered. And in that suffering, some fled, others fought, and many simply vanished. What the sea peoples did was move through this chaos. Some may have caused it, some were caught in it. But they became the symbol of it. In the records that survived, we see them not as villains, but as warnings. In Egyptian carvings, they arrived by land and sea, with ox carts carrying families. It's not just warriors, but entire populations. They are not described with hatred. They're described with awe, confusion, and fear. The Egyptians themselves faced them in two great battles, once during the reign of Merneptah, and again during the reign of Ramses III. Both times, the pharaohs claimed victory. But even in victory, the tone was defensive. The threat had come close, too close. Egypt survived, but it would never be the same. As the resources spent, the trust in the world beyond its borders, the sense of eternal power, all were shaken. And yet, the sea peoples did not settle in Egypt. They vanished into the records again. Some may have moved inland. Others may have blended into the local populations. In time, some of their names, like the Peloponnesian, would become linked to new peoples, like the Philistines. But as a whole, the sea peoples disappeared. Their language, culture, and origin remain unknown. We only see their shadows, never their faces. Still, their impact was profound. After their movement, the world they passed through was no longer the same. It was simpler, smaller. The great empires shrank or disappeared. Scripts were lost. Trade slowed. It was as if the sea had taken a breath and let the ancient world fall still. What came after would be different, not necessarily worse, but born from ashes. And as you drift tonight, imagine the glow of distant fires on the horizon, flickering on waves that carry secrets. Imagine standing on a quiet shore, feeling a breeze that smells of salt and smoke. Somewhere beyond the water, a world is changing. And even now, we do not know exactly why. In the golden sands of Egypt, where the Nile winds slowly through the desert, and the sun rises with timeless rhythm, change was coming. Pharaoh Ramses III ruled during this fragile period, and he saw with his own eyes what the sea peoples could do. Word had already reached him of burned cities, fallen kings, and ships without flags moving like shadows along the coast. But now, it would be tested. Ramses was not blind to the warnings. He strengthened his defenses, built fortresses, and gathered his army. Egypt's borders had always been guarded, but now they braced for something different, something unfamiliar. These invaders didn't come as messengers or even as enemies with known intentions. They came with families, livestock, and all their belongings. Not just an army, but a migration. They were moving to stay. In the great inscriptions left behind, Ramses III described the sea peoples arriving by both land and sea. He names the Pelessa, the Jeker, the Denyan, and others. He speaks of a coalition, vast and determined, sweeping down through Syria and into the lands bordering Egypt. The battles that followed were fierce, yet strangely quiet in the ancient writings. There are no detailed tactics, only images, boats clashing, soldiers falling, and the pharaoh standing tall. The sea battle was perhaps the most remarkable. Egypt lured the invaders into a narrow river mouth, trapping their ships. Archers rained arrows from the shores, while Egyptian vessels rammed and boarded. The carvings in the temples of Medinet Habu show the battle like a dream, crowded, chaotic, but under the control of divine order. Ramses claimed complete victory. Perhaps for that moment he truly did win. Yet even in victory, there was a shift. The sea peoples had not conquered Egypt, but they had changed it. The resources spent in defense could not be regained. The surrounding lands, once part of Egypt's trade network, were in ruins. Many of Egypt's allies had vanished. The international world Ramses inherited had crumbled, and even though he wore the crown and held the throne, the world beneath it was quieter. After the battle, some of the sea peoples may have been allowed to settle in southern Canaan, in lands now part of ancient Palestine. Archaeological records show a new culture emerging, one with pottery, weapons, and building styles unlike those of the earlier inhabitants. This may have been the transformation of raiders into residents, of warriors into farmers. Perhaps they became neighbors. Perhaps they became something new. Egypt, proud and ancient, retreated into itself in the years that followed. It no longer sent armies into far lands. It no longer received tributes from distant cities. The temples still stood. The statues still gazed across the sand. But the reach of the pharaohs had shortened. And the memory of that sea invasion, etched in stone and song, remained long after Ramses himself was gone. And the sea peoples? They vanished once again. No kings rose in their name, no monuments declared their legacy. But their influence lived on not in the records of victory, but in the silence that followed. In the quiet rebuilding of towns, the lost scripts, the empty palaces reclaimed by nature. They were not a people who built, but a people who revealed the fault lines in what had been built by others. And as the centuries passed, the memory of those battles faded, the inscriptions weathered, the names blurred, but the waves kept moving, touching the same shores. Sometimes in the hush of early morning, when the sea is still and the wind is light, it's easy to imagine them again, those ships without flags. Those families on the move, and the uncertain eyes of people stepping onto strange lands. So tonight, let the Nile carry you gently, let its steady flow remind you of how civilizations come and go. Even mighty kings must one day rest. And how the mystery of the sea peoples is not in what they destroyed, but in how they disappeared. Long after the sea peoples had vanished from the written records, the ground still remembered them. Beneath layers of earth and ash, traces of their journey remained. Pieces of pottery, broken weapons, new building styles in old cities. Though their names faded, their presence had left a signature in the very soil. And slowly, patiently, the world began to uncover it. Archaeologists, centuries later, would find the puzzle scattered across different lands. In the ruins of Ashkelon, they discovered homes built with a style never seen before in the region. Thick-walled structures, storage pits, and unique hearths pointed to a new culture, one that had arrived suddenly, then settled. Nearby, in Ekron and Gaza, similar evidence appeared. These were not temporary camps. These were new beginnings. Even more telling were the bones. Human and animal remains, showing different patterns of diet and lifestyle. The newcomers seemed to eat more pork than the local populations. Their pottery was handmade, not wheel-thrown, decorated with strange lines and curves that echoed Aegean designs. And over time, their styles changed, blending with local traditions. It was as if two worlds had collided, and then slowly, gently, formed something new. The Philistines, mentioned in later biblical texts, may have been one of these groups. Though the name comes from different sources, many scholars believe the Philistines were among the sea peoples. Perhaps descendants of the Peloponnesian mentioned by the Egyptians. Their arrival marked not just a moment of conflict, but a shift in the cultural map of the Levant, a new thread woven into an ancient tapestry. But even as we uncover more, the mystery deepens. The sea peoples did not write their own history. We have no epic poems from their perspective, no scrolls or songs telling of their journey, their origin, or their beliefs. All we have are the remnants, the things they touched, the places they changed, and the legends they left behind in the minds of those who feared them. Some scholars suggest they came from the Aegean, perhaps displaced Mycenaeans or refugees from Crete. Others point to the Western Mediterranean, drawing links to Sardinia, Sicily, or even farther. The pottery styles connect some dots, the weapons match others. But still, the whole picture remains blurred, like a distant shoreline seen through morning fog. The lack of written evidence is part of what makes their story so haunting. They arrived during a time when writing was already known, but did not leave their words behind. It's possible they used perishable materials, or that their tradition was oral, or that they simply did not record events the way their enemies did. And so, their voice is silent, and silence, as always, invites wonder. But their influence can't be denied. Cities changed after their passing. Languages evolved. Art shifted. And in every place they touched, new ideas took root. Whether they came as invaders or settlers, they became part of the story. And the Bronze Age, once so steady and complex, gave way to a new age, one shaped in part by their presence. So as you rest now, picture the archaeologists, gently brushing dust from a buried handle, or lifting a cracked bowl into the light. Imagine the quiet awe in their faces as they realize they're holding something touched by a forgotten people. And know that history is not always told in words. Sometimes it waits patiently in stone and soil, waiting for someone to find it. After the Sea Peoples passed through history, they left not a song, not a banner, not a monument in their name, but silence, the kind that lingers after something vast and unexplainable has occurred. That silence stretched over centuries, and in that silence, historians, poets, and seekers leaned in, trying to listen, trying to understand what had come and where it had gone. In the absence of written records from the Sea Peoples themselves, the ancient Egyptians became their primary storytellers. But even those accounts were selective. The inscriptions of Ramses III, carved in massive stone walls, showed images of battle and victory. Rows of ships, foreign warriors captured or defeated, families on the move. But there were no details of the Sea People's lives, no attempts to explain their motives. Just that they came and they were repelled. This silence is not emptiness. It is potential. It is space filled with possibilities. Maybe they were fleeing disaster, drought, famine, earthquakes, or war. Maybe they were chasing a better life carried by winds they could not control. Or perhaps they were both refugees and raiders, survivors and settlers. The truth may lie in all of these ideas, layered like the stones of a forgotten wall. We sometimes imagine history as a straight line, one event following another like footsteps in sand. But with the Sea Peoples, the line is broken. There are pieces missing, bridges washed away. And this reminds us that history is not always a clear story. It's a soft echo, bouncing between what was recorded and what was lost. The Sea Peoples are part of that echo. Their disappearance is just as fascinating as their arrival. After causing the collapse or weakening of empires from the Hittites to the Mycenaeans, they did not rise in power themselves. They did not establish a great capital or empire. Instead, they dissolved into the cultures they encountered. They settled, adapted, faded. They became part of something else. And in doing so, they became invisible. This blending is part of what made them successful. It allowed their descendants to survive where their own kingdoms had fallen. The Philistines, for instance, went on to be a powerful force in the region for centuries. But they no longer looked like outsiders. Their art, language, and lifestyle evolved to match the local patterns. It had become of the land, not above it. This transformation is also a gentle lesson in change. Sometimes it's not the conqueror who endures, but the one who adapts. The Sea Peoples, whoever they were, did not cling to an identity that the world would not support. They became part of something new, and in that choice, whether conscious or not, they outlasted the chaos they helped create. The silence around their name has inspired generations of curiosity. Books, documentaries, and debates still try to solve the riddle, but maybe the mystery itself is part of the meaning. Maybe their story is meant to remind us that not all questions have answers, that sometimes the journey is more important than the destination, that those who vanish do not always disappear. And as you lie still, picture the sea once more. It's not raging with ships, but quiet again, stars above, salt air, the gentle rocking of waves. Somewhere in that silence, if you listen softly enough, you may hear the faint voices of a people long gone, not calling out for attention, just moving forward like the tide. The time after the Sea Peoples moved through the world was quieter, but not in a peaceful way. It was the silence that follows a storm. The land still stood. The rivers still flowed. People still lived, worked, and prayed. But something had changed. The great systems that once connected distant cities and distant kings had broken. And in their place, smaller worlds began to rise. The Bronze Age, with its trade routes, its scribes, and its palace economies, faded into memory. Cities that once bustled with merchants and officials were now little more than villages. Temples fell into disrepair. Scripts that had once recorded royal orders and tax collections simply stopped being written. And where once a single letter could summon a fleet or army, now local chieftains ruled with simpler tools. This change wasn't just in the buildings, it was in the way people lived. That long-distance trade, the exotic goods that had once filled palaces disappeared. No more copper from Cyprus or tin from the east, or fine glass, precious oils, or painted jars from faraway shores. Instead, people returned to basics: farming small plots, herding animals, trading with nearby villages. Life became slower, more fragile, but also more grounded. We call this period the Late Bronze Age collapse. It wasn't just a fall, it was a reset. And from this quiet soil, new cultures began to rise. In Greece, the Mycenaean palaces never returned, but small communities would eventually grow into the classical cities of Athens and Sparta. In Canaan, the mixture of old cultures and newcomers gave birth to the world of the ancient Israelites and their neighbors. In Anatolia, the vacuum left by the Hittites opened space for new languages, new rulers, and new ideas. But this rebuilding took time, centuries in fact. In the early stages, much was forgotten. Skills were lost. Technologies vanished. In some places, even the art of writing disappeared entirely. It would not return until new scripts were born, inspired by different needs and new voices. And so, the world had to learn again how to record its own story. The Sea Peoples were not the only cause of this collapse, but they became its symbol, the wave that hit the fragile web of the Bronze Age and made it tremble. And when the web broke, it wasn't just palaces and walls that fell. It was the idea that the world would always be the same, that empires would always last, that order was permanent. In their movement, the Sea Peoples reminded the world of how quickly things can change. And yet, from the stillness, something beautiful happened. The darkness of the collapse made way for new light. New languages, new myths, new cities, all born from the ashes. The Iron Age would soon follow, bring in new tools, new ideas, and a different kind of world. Sea Peoples vanished, but the world kept turning. We sometimes imagine collapse as the end, but it can also be a beginning, a pause before the next chapter. The Sea Peoples didn't destroy the world. They interrupted it, gave it space to break, to breathe, to begin again. So tonight, if your thoughts wandered to ancient shores, imagine those early survivors planting seeds, shaping tools, whispering old songs to new children. Their stories may not have been written, but they were lived. And in every quiet village, under every rebuilt roof, the world remembered how to start over. When we speak of the Sea Peoples, we use names handed down to us by others. The Egyptians carved their names in stone: Sherdon, Peliset, Jeker, Denyen, Washesh. But these were not names the Sea Peoples gave themselves. They are echoes, fragments, labels placed by those who feared them, fought them, or watched them pass by. And so, what we call them may not be who they truly were. Imagine trying to understand a traveler from a distant land, only knowing how they looked or what language they spoke. You might name them after their weapons, their ships, or even the direction they came from. That is what the ancients did. They recorded what they saw: foreign helmets, curved swords, families with carts, sails with painted signs. But they never truly understood the people behind the image. Take the Sherdon, for instance. Some believe they came from Sardinia. Their helmets, shown in Egyptian carvings, have horns or crests, unlike any other. Others suggest they were mercenaries, serving both Egypt and its enemies at different times. The Peliset are often linked to the Philistines, who later appear in biblical texts. The Danaan may connect to the Danaans of Greek legend. The Jeker and Washesh remain even more mysterious. But for each of these, the truth is elusive. Their origins could stretch far west or deep inland. They may have been united only by the sea, drawn together in desperation or hope. Their alliances might have been temporary, their cultures diverse, and their journey not a single wave, but a long migration unfolding over decades. This is why the Sea Peoples are so difficult to define. They don't fit into a single story. They don't rise and fall like a kingdom. They don't leave behind a unified legacy. Instead, they appear in many places at once, always in motion. Like wind across water, you can see their effect but not grasp their form. Perhaps this is why their story still captivates us. Because they represent something we don't fully understand. Not just in history, but in ourselves. Change that comes suddenly. Movement without a map. The blending of cultures and ideas. The Sea Peoples may have come from different backgrounds, but together, they carried with them a kind of power one that didn't build monuments but changed everything in its path. In later centuries, their memory softened. They became a puzzle for scholars, a curiosity for historians. But for those who lived through their arrival, they were not a curiosity. They were real. Their footsteps shook the earth, their sails darkened the horizon, and their presence forced others to choose, flee, fight, or adapt. The Sea Peoples remind us that history isn't always written by those who win or endure. Sometimes it's shaped by those who pass through and leave only questions behind. Their names, though uncertain, still drift through time. And like the wind, they leave behind a trace not in their own words, but in how the world changed around them. So now, as you rest, imagine those ancient names whispered across the waves, spoken in languages long forgotten, carried by breezes that touch distant shores. They do not ask to be understood, only to be remembered softly, like the tide that once brought them to land. The time after the Sea Peoples moved through the world was quieter, but not in a peaceful way. It was the silence that follows a storm. The land still stood. The rivers still flowed. People still lived, worked, and prayed. But something had changed. The great systems that once connected distant cities and distant kings had broken. And in their place, smaller worlds began to rise. The Bronze Age, with its trade routes, its scribes, and its palace economies, faded into memory. Cities that once bustled with merchants and officials were now little more than villages. Temples fell into disrepair. Scripts that had once recorded royal orders and tax collections simply stopped being written. And where once a single letter could summon a fleet or army, now local chieftains ruled with simpler tools. This change wasn't just in the buildings, it was in the way people lived. That long-distance trade, the exotic goods that had once filled palaces disappeared. No more copper from Cyprus or tin from the east, or fine glass, precious oils, or painted jars from faraway shores. Instead, people returned to basics, farming small plots, herding animals, trading with nearby villages. Life became slower, more fragile, but also more grounded. We call this period the Late Bronze Age collapse. It wasn't just a fall, it was a reset. And from this quiet soil, new cultures began to rise. In Greece, the Mycenaean palaces never returned, but small communities would eventually grow into the classical cities of Athens and Sparta. In Canaan, the mixture of old cultures and newcomers gave birth to the world of the ancient Israelites and their neighbors. In Anatolia, the vacuum left by the Hittites opened space for new languages, new rulers, and new ideas. But this rebuilding took time, centuries in fact. In the early stages, much was forgotten. Skills were lost. Technologies vanished. In some places, even the art of writing disappeared entirely. It would not return until new scripts were born, inspired by different needs and new voices. And so, the world had to learn again how to record its own story. The Sea Peoples were not the only cause of this collapse, but they became its symbol, the wave that hit the fragile web of the Bronze Age and made it tremble. And when the web broke, it wasn't just palaces and walls that fell. It was the idea that the world would always be the same, that empires would always last, that order was permanent. In their movement, the Sea Peoples reminded the world of how quickly things can change. And yet, from the stillness, something beautiful happened. The darkness of the collapse made way for new light. New languages, new myths, new cities, all born from the ashes. The Iron Age would soon follow, bring in new tools, new ideas, in a different kind of world. The Sea Peoples vanished, but the world kept turning. We sometimes imagine collapse as the end, but it can also be a beginning. A pause before the next chapter. The Sea Peoples didn't destroy the world. They interrupted it, gave it space to break, to breathe, to begin again. When we speak of the Sea Peoples, we use names handed down to us by others. The Egyptians carved their names in stone: Sherdin, Peliset, Jeker, Denyen, Washesh. But these were not names the Sea Peoples gave themselves. They are echoes, fragments, labels placed by those who feared them, fought them, or watched them pass by. And so, what we call them may not be who they truly were. Imagine trying to understand a traveler from a distant land, only knowing how they looked or what language they spoke. You might name them after their weapons, their ships, or even the direction they came from. That is what the ancients did. They recorded what they saw, Foreign helmets, curved swords, families with carts, sails with painted signs. But they never truly understood the people behind the image. Take the Sheridan, for instance. Some believe they came from Sardinia. Their helmets, shown in Egyptian carvings, have horns or crests, unlike any other. Others suggest they were mercenaries, serving both Egypt and its enemies at different times. The Peloponnesians are often linked to the Philistines, who later appear in biblical texts. The Danaan may connect to the Danaans of Greek legend. The Jeker and Washesh remain even more mysterious. But for each of these, the truth is elusive. Their origins could stretch far west or deep inland. They may have been united only by the sea, drawn together in desperation or hope. Their alliances might have been temporary, their cultures diverse, and their journey not a single wave, but a long migration unfolding over decades. This is why the sea peoples are so difficult to define. They don't fit into a single story. They don't rise and fall like a kingdom. They don't leave behind a unified legacy. Instead, they appear in many places at once, always in motion. Like wind across water, you can see their effect but not grasp their form. Perhaps this is why their story still captivates us. Because they represent something we don't fully understand. Not just in history, but in ourselves. Change that comes suddenly. Movement without a map. The blending of cultures and ideas. The sea peoples may have come from different backgrounds, but together, they carried with them a kind of power one that didn't build monuments but changed everything in its path. In later centuries, their memory softened. They became a puzzle for scholars, a curiosity for historians. But for those who lived through their arrival, they were not a curiosity. They were real. Their footsteps shook the earth, their sails darkened the horizon, and their presence forced others to choose, flee, fight, or adapt. The sea peoples remind us that history isn't always written by those who win or endure. Sometimes it's shaped by those who pass through and leave only questions behind. Their names, though uncertain, still drift through time. And like the wind, they leave behind a trace not in their own words, but in how the world changed around them. There is something about the sea that holds secrets. Beneath its shifting surface lie the remains of ships, cities, and voices long lost to time. And somewhere, perhaps scattered along the seabed, lie traces of the sea peoples. We have never found their homeland, but maybe that's because it no longer exists. Maybe the places they came from were swallowed by waves, or changed so deeply that memory no longer connects them to their past. Underwater archaeology offers quiet glimpses into that mystery. Off the coasts of Turkey, Cyprus, and the Levant, divers have discovered wrecked ships, ancient vessels with hulls still intact, cargoes preserved in silence, or in ferry filled with wine or oil, metal ingots, weapons, tools. Each item rests in the dark, undisturbed for thousands of years. These are not the grand ruins of temples or palaces. They're humble, but they whisper. Some of these ships may have belonged to the sea peoples. Others may have belonged to those they attacked. But together, they help tell the story of a world in motion, of trade, migration, and conflict. The sea does not keep borders. It carries whatever enters it. Perhaps that's why the sea peoples seem so hard to place. They did not come from one place. They came from many, brought together by currents stronger than themselves. The ocean hides and protects. It erases names, but preserves shapes. A bronze sword pulled from the seabed might still bear the marks of its maker. A cooking pot might still contain the ashes of its last fire. These objects do not speak in sentences, but they do speak. They tell us of people who lived, traveled, and hoped. People who saw the same sun and stars that we do, and moved toward them with dreams in their hearts. Modern technology now allows us to scan the ocean floor. Sonar reveals shipwrecks buried beneath sand. Remote cameras explore ruins once thought unreachable. Each discovery brings us closer, not just to the sea peoples, but to the world they entered. And the more we uncover, the more we realize how connected the ancient world truly was. The same jar might appear in Cyprus, then in the Nile Delta, then in a ruin near modern-day Gaza. These threads help us understand the sea peoples, even without their voices. They show us that migration was not unusual. People moved, they traded, intermarried, adopted new customs. What made the sea peoples different may not have been that they moved, but that they moved all at once. During a moment of global weakness, when empires were crumbling and hunger was near, we tend to look at the past through the lens of nations and borders. The sea peoples remind us that not everyone fits neatly into such shapes. We're families, warriors, farmers, sailors. They may have fought when they had to, but they also settled, built homes, raised children, and those children in time became part of the lands they once changed. Perhaps their homeland was never a place, but a way of living, tied to the water, to movement, to resilience. In that sense, they never truly vanished. Their story continued, transformed in new generations, who blended into Canaanite cities, Greek islands, and Anatolian valleys. The sea remembers them not with statues, but with motion. Now we come to the quiet end of the sea people's journey, not an end marked by final battle or collapse, but by disappearance. They entered history as a storm and left as a whisper, and what they left behind is not just ruins or relics, but questions gentle. Patient questions that still sit quietly in museums, on shorelines, and in the minds of those who study the past. Their story is not one of triumph or domination. It is a story of motion, of change, of lives moving through history without leaving clear footprints. And that, in its own way, makes it more human. Most of us do not leave behind monuments. We leave behind traces, moments, memories, small things that matter deeply to those who know how to look. The sea peoples remind us that history is not always carved in stone. Sometimes it is written in the gaps between stories, in the layers of earth that cover broken homes, in the names passed down without knowing where they started. They existed, there is no doubt. They changed the world. But they left no map, no clear message. Only the results of their passage. And yet, we remember them. We remember them because they made people stop and take notice. Because in their movement, they forced the ancient world to change. Because their mystery draws us in. Not every culture needs to build great temples to be remembered. Sometimes it is enough to shift the path of history gently, irrevocably. In a way, they represent everyone who ever moved in search of safety or freedom or something better. Everyone who faced a world that no longer welcomed them and chose to keep going. Everyone who, in the face of uncertainty, stepped forward anyway. And in remembering them, we honor not only their history, but our own potential to carry stories forward even without words. The Bronze Age did not end because of one reason. It ended because of many. The sea peoples were part of that. So was nature. So was time. So was the quiet unraveling of systems that had grown too complex, too dependent on distant shores and long chains of trust. And when those chains broke, it was not chaos that came, it was change. From that change, the Iron Age rose. Simpler tools, smaller cities, new languages. People rebuilt not what was lost, but what was needed. And in that rebuilding, the world made room for new myths, new cultures, and new hopes. The sea peoples did not live to see what came next, but they helped make it possible, even if unintentionally. Today, we honor them not with certainty, but with curiosity, not with perfect knowledge, but with wonder. And perhaps that's how they would want to be remembered, not as conquerors, not as invaders, but as travelers who moved through a moment of great change and left behind a world transformed. Let the waves carry you one last time. Let the rhythm of the water calm your thoughts. Imagine the open sea, wide, blue, endless, and a small sail in the distance, quietly fading into the horizon. The sea peoples are gone, but their mystery remains. And in that mystery we find something gentle, something endless, something still waiting to be understood.